Gentlemen, is this on? Yeah, I think it's on. I think because we are running a little bit late, we might as well start immediately with this next spotlight session, which is on rule of law and anti-corruption reforms. For those of you who I haven't met yet in the past day and a half, my name is Wouter Zweers. I'm a research fellow at the Clingendael Institute in the Netherlands, where I focus on, well, mostly on EU enlargement and on the Europe's eastern neighborhood. And I'm extremely pleased to moderate this short spotlight session, as I said, on rule of law, anti-corruption reforms. My task is very difficult today because, not only because we have only 45 minutes, but also because we have two Srđans in the panel, which complicates things. Nevertheless, let me start by quickly introducing our speakers, and then we can take it from there. I'd like to start with His Excellency Mr. Kreshnik Ahmeti, Deputy Minister, Foreign Affairs and Diaspora of the Republic of Kosovo. Thank you very much for being here today. Our second speaker in the panel, Ms. Viola von Cramon-Taubadel. She's a member of European Parliament for the Greens, where she's rapporteur for the accession process of Kosovo, part of the Foreign Affairs Committee, amongst many other functions and positions. A warm welcome to you as well. Then we arrive at the Srđans.
The problem.
First, I'd like to welcome Mr. Srđan Blagovčanin, Chairman of the Board of Directors of Transparency International Bosnia and Herzegovina. Glad to have you here. Thanks. And last but not least, Mr. Srđan Majstorović, Chairman of the Governing Board of the European Policy Center in Belgrade. So welcome to you as well.
Thank you.
In this spotlight session, I'd like to focus on, three broad topics. I think we would first do well to try and look at the current state of anti-corruption and rule of law reforms in the Western Balkans. Of course, we've seen the reports from the European Commission being published a few weeks ago. Secondly, I think we cannot talk about these issues without taking into account geopolitical volatility that we've seen in our continent this year following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And third, as we are here at the Civil Society Forum of the Berlin process, it would be good to also have a look at the recommendations from last year and see what the role is of civil society in, motivating governments to do the necessary reforms. Now we will first start with the opening statements of our panelists. I will use my position as a moderator to pose some follow-up questions thereafter, and then at the end we hopefully have some time for Q&A as well. So please do already think about questions you would like to ask our speakers. I'm going to be strict with the time. I would like to ask our panelists to take 5 minutes maximum for the opening statements, and I will intervene after that time. I'd like to start with you, Mr. Ahmeti. Kosovo report of the enlargement package noted some progress in your country's fight against corruption, as well as in developing a well-functioning judicial system. But also the Commission on its website noted that your country needs to intensify its efforts to strengthen democracy, public administration, rule of law, and fight corruption. So I would like to ask you, were you surprised about the report? Were you happy with the report of the European Commission? And do you feel that it adequately captured the reform dynamics in your country? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you for having putting us together here and having me here and discuss this important issue. Of course, as with every report, the subject that is being reported on has some topics that might want to correct, but that is true the same way that every country still needs reforms and progress. You know, progress is perpetual in the sense that you never reach a final destination. But we were glad that this year's country report noted the progress made last year by the government, And it is the first time in the case of Kosovo that no areas were identified as backsliding or no progress, which I believe shows that Kosovo is entering a new phase in its democratic, institutional, and economic matters and progress. It is clear that more work needs to be done, but from my point of view, it's important that the trends are positive. As a government, we won the elections in an unprecedented majority with two main commitments, two J's we called them, jobs and justice. And these two J's became the two pillars of our governmental program. So as today we are focusing mostly on the rule of law and fighting corruption, I will focus on the second J, the justice of our program. We are undergoing major reforms and restructuring in the judicial system in Kosovo. Last year we we approved in the government the rule of law strategy for 5 years, which is a kind of an umbrella for reforming our judicial system in general. So I'll go briefly to mention the laws on which we've worked on. We approved the vetting process in accordance with the recommendations of the Venice Commission, which I believe is really important because we also have to deal with the wrongdoings of the past. And also we have voted a number of laws that restructure the judicial system, which means that for the future we are creating the mechanisms for a fair treatment of our citizens and businesses. For example, we also established for the first time the commercial court, which has started to work now since September, and this helps the economy a lot. I won't go through every one of them since I do not want to pass the time, but besides dealing with the past and make the mechanism for the future, we are also dealing with the present in the sense of fighting corruption and organized crime. And here the figures, I believe, are impressive. There are 797 police operations which dealt for a year and a half with organized crime and fight against corruption. Over 2,000 people have been indicted and arrested in charges of organized crime and corruption, and 265 of them were public officials. And 69 criminal groups have been destroyed for a year and a half since the government is in place. So this fight against corruption and organized crimes and these reforms have been acknowledged also by independent international institutions. For example, Kosovo has been ranked the first in Western Balkans by the World Justice Report on Rule of Law. In the Transparency International Index, it improved its position by 17 places. Also, Kosovo jumped by 17 places on the Press Freedom Index of the Reporters Without Borders. And more recently, Kosovo was ranked first in Europe and second globally for the biggest improvement in rule of law in 2021 from World Justice Project.
Thank you very much. Just as and thank you for outlining some of these results that your government has achieved over the past time. Maybe as a short follow-up question, where do you see need or the room or the space for intensifying efforts? Are there specific fields where you say in the coming months, this is where we really want to achieve the next step?
The next step would be the reforms in judicial system, because you can work, you can fight corruption and organized crime in the field, so to say, on the ground. But if it gets, the bottleneck currently is at the judicial system, and you cannot finalize fighting corruption and organized crime that way. So I believe with the vetting process and having more credibility and more capacity in our judicial system, this would be our main, this will be our main focus in the coming months and years, because it's a relatively long process and a complex one.
Thank you. Moving to Ms. van Cramon, zooming out maybe from Kosovo to the region at large, how do you see the current state and the progress of the rule of law, anti-corruption reforms in the countries of the region? And, well, how do you see the Commission reports that were published in that regard? Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks, Wouter, for giving me the opportunity to at least give some remarks on the situation, how it is being seen from Brussels, from the EU institutions, so to say, and also especially from the Parliament side, why, of course, it's important to recall that rule of law is the pillar for all the things we do on behalf of any accession process, and sometimes it is a little bit overseen when we speak about alignment with common foreign policy and security policy or other issues, but in a nutshell, we really should focus much more on what's happening on rule of law and how much this would also influence the development, the domestic development in all of the countries. And the example of Kosovo shows how much a country can change when the political will is there, and how much it makes a difference if you have a country who puts this as one of their top priorities. We can go into more details on what is maybe missing, but in general, I mean, you see a significant shift from not just the index, but also in terms of content on the ground. So I think it is important to say that rule of law is the main precondition for all kinds of EU accession processes, and this is laid down in the Copenhagen criteria. And of course, that goes hand in hand with the fight against corruption. And there, I would say, we have a very, let's say, different pictures in some of the countries. I think the EU has been much too loose and has been not strict enough when it comes to the merit-based process. I think there was a huge backsliding and rather fake implementation of reforms, which sometimes you can find on paper, but really not in a practical term. And of course, if things have no consequence, it is extremely hard for the political actors to say, well, if we go away with it, why should we change the course? So on one hand, I think it is important that we focus much more on supporting civil society, such as transparency, but also many others who monitor the process in the particular countries. But on the other hand, if we have the progress report, which clearly states that there's no progress in many of the countries, then it has to have severe consequences, especially in financial terms, because, I mean, being honest, I'm the biggest promoter of EU enlargement, and I just come from a conference where I expressed my frustration that there is no progress. But on the other hand, we also need to remind our friends in the region that it is very closely interlinked with when my taxpayers ask me, what do you think, is the money properly invested? And you think, yes, in general, yes, but. Yeah. So of course I know that in the state capture countries such as Serbia, it is extremely difficult to make sure that without independent media, without independent judiciary, there is a fair and free, let's say, procurement process and so on and so forth, while everything is in the hand of one party, is in the hand of one person who actually rules the country, and there is no competition whatsoever, and there's no independent judiciary, there's no prosecution. And that needs to be, I think, communicated in a different way and has to have proper sanction. So the example of Montenegro, I think we have partially seen that there were some attempts to go after grant and pity corruption, but of course it's extremely difficult while we see that there is a political crisis to finally things which are obviously right, but you do not have a political majority for those reforms, and then in the end the picture is still rather gray than white, which we at least see it's not really fair, because there are some people in Montenegro who have no interest whatsoever to go for real reforms. And so we can go through the individual countries, but I think the European Parliament in general is always on the side of the civil society and of those forces and those groups and those institutions in the country who would like to see reforms being implemented, and of course a more transparent and a more integral political framework for the economical environment, but also for the political environment.
Well, thank you very much. And coming from the Netherlands, I very much agree with your point that the rule of law is maybe the main precondition in the whole EU enlargement framework. Mr. Blagovčanin, if we zoom in on Bosnia and Herzegovina, how do you see the state of rule of law reforms in that country? I think we've seen some of us were maybe a little bit surprised that the European Commission made the recommendation to grant Bosnia and Herzegovina candidate status. Do you feel that this is directly related to reform progress in the country, or may there have been some other factors that played a role there, please?
Yes, many thanks. And first of all, I would like to thank organizers and the German government for organizing this great event. I believe that is very important, in particular in this moment. And also, I'm very glad that we are discussing state of rule of law and fight against corruption in the Balkans. Not only because I'm coming from Transparency International, but I believe that we would all agree that establishing or strengthening the rule of law and the fight against corruption are precondition for the implementation of all recommendations that we put together as part of our joint work. By the same token, I would also say that I believe that strengthening or establishing a rule of law and meaningful fight against corruption are the most complex tasks for the Western Balkan countries on their reform path towards the EU. The most complex in a way that substantial progress in those areas would require complete overhaul and transformation of our societies and our political systems in the way how they operate in terms of separation of the power, which is still problematic, I would say, across the region, in terms of limitation of power, in terms of check and balances, protecting human rights, etc. Unfortunately, and let's be honest, we haven't seen much progress all across the region. We do have laws adopted, we do have institutions formed, but when it comes to results, in practice, I would say that we haven't seen much progress. Back to your question, to zoom in on the situation in Bosnia, sorry for a long intro. Yes, good news is that European Commission recommended granting candidacy status to Bosnia and Herzegovina last month on the occasion of publishing enlargement package. But in the same time, European Commission concluded in the report for Bosnia and Herzegovina that there has been no progress whatsoever. On the contrary, deterioration of the situation. So you shouldn't be an expert on Bosnia or EU enlargement to conclude that the recommendation was not based on merit criteria. A little bit retrospective. In 2019, European Commission issued an opinion on candidacy application of Bosnia and Herzegovina with 14 priorities that should be implemented by Bosnia and Herzegovina in order for Bosnia to get candidacy status. After 3 years, only 2 priorities have been implemented partially.
Now they are awarded.
So it's obvious that situation since 2019 in Bosnia and Herzegovina deteriorated dramatically. Due to the political and institutional crisis, country sliding towards ungovernability. Basic functions are in question in a country. So in that regard, Bosnia and Herzegovina is a very good example what happened when we neglect rule of law and anti-corruption. And just few facts from TI surveys. Bosnia and Herzegovina is ranked 3rd worst corrupt country in Europe, and in the same time among the countries globally where the situation deteriorates the most. So very illustrative. And in the same time, Bosnia and Herzegovina has no strategy or any policy against corruption or judicial strategy for the judicial reform. So that's obvious that there is no political will in that regard. And for illustration how a dramatic situation is, only this year, the highest ranking judicial office holders have been blacklisted by United States administration on the ground of being involved in political corruption or due to links with organized crime. So basically, it's total symbiosis of the state with organized crime, mafia, drug trafficking, and it's difficult to find the borderline between two of that. So obviously,
please come to a conclusion. Thank you.
just to
yeah, of course.
So obviously, current approach doesn't work. And that leads us to the famous Einstein quote, if you're doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, it is not maybe the best or the most clever strategy to do in such context. So what I would like, and I will conclude with that, what I would like to say that we would need, and I believe that we will all agree on the size of the problem and urgency of the problem and the importance of the problem all across the region, but what we would need to find different approach towards the strengthening or establishing rule of law depends on the country context, and fight against corruption, and to take it really seriously and as a matter of priority.
Well, thank you, and maybe we can try to end this panel with some outlooks for the future and some ideas. Thank you for painting this picture, a bleak picture, I must say. Maybe moving on to Mr. Majstorović, it seemed that there was some good news last week when Commission President von der Leyen tweeted that Serbia is advanced on its EU integration path. So, looking at rule of law, democratization efforts, and the European Commission report, would you agree with her statement, and how do you see Serbia's current efforts in combating corruption and promoting rule of law? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wouter. It's a pleasure to be here in Berlin. Let me start by saying that when Srđan speaks, when I speak, we really do not want to send a message of doom and gloom. And this is what we are facing in events like this, being labeled as some sort of very dark people who are criticizing their country. Unfortunately, this is reality in which we are living in. And this is the fact. This is not promotion of the doom and gloom. No. So please be aware of this labeling before we start. On the statement, or rather tweet of Ms. von der Leyen, it was disappointing. I mean, maybe you saw my message on Twitter. It was disappointing because the institution that she's heading came up with a report just 2 weeks ago, which said that Serbia is only moderately prepared to assume the obligations from the membership. And this ranking of Serbia has not changed since 2016. And this is a problem that Srđan was mentioning, that the process, it's not working, it's not delivering. But what we witness with this public display of enthusiasm is disappointing because with that she's undermining the role of the civil society, of the critical voices in our countries. It's very difficult after that statement to go out to TV and to say that things are not going well in Serbia, when the President of the European Commission herself said that Serbia is well advanced and that Serbia is going the right way. And we all know that Serbia has a problem. And this is the second point of your question. Serbian leadership is not even close enough to prove its serious intention to fulfill the EU accession requirements. I'm publicly trying to explain to citizens of Serbia that the situation in Serbia today is much worse than 10 years ago when we applied for the accession to the EU membership. At that time, European Commission made an assessment, said that Serbia is sufficiently prepared in the sense of respect to democracy, rule of law, democratic principles. But this today is not the fact. And this is an alarming situation. The division of power, the lines of division of powers have been blurred. We don't know where the political influence on judiciary starts and where does it stop. The parliament is behaving like a part of the executive. This is not natural status of the political system that is supposed to be a healthy one. So the political system is being corrupted. It is being corrupted with the fact that we have irregular electoral rounds of elections that nobody knows when they will happen. In the past, Raša Nedeljkov here is from CRTA, and they're a very prominent organization that follows the electoral processes in Serbia. In the last 6 years, we had 4 rounds of elections. It's not the natural environment for democracy, for democratic institutions, to deliver what is required. And to come to a conclusion, not to be extensive, either we will move forward and try to regain the trust in the transformative and transactional power of the EU integration process, or we will come into a situation where our citizens will keep joining the EU by foot, and our governments will remain stuck back in the Balkans and discussing same old stories and the same crises that they helped to develop and now pretending to be resolving. So I'll stop here for the introductory part.
Thank you very much. Let's move to the sort of the second topic, because of course, rule of law reforms are not taking place in a vacuum. We've seen this year, as I said at the beginning, the geopolitical volatility on the European continent, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Mr. Ahmeti, I'd like to ask you, how does the war in Ukraine, do you see maybe an impact of those geopolitical tensions and this invasion of Ukraine on rule of law reforms, on democratization efforts? Is there a link between the two?
You might find some impact, of course. It depends on how the situation was even prior to the aggression. Kosovo is a democratic country. For example, I mentioned the unprecedented support that we got in the recent general elections, but immediately after that, in the local elections, the opposition parties won the majority of the municipalities, which shows that there is rotation of power, which is really important. What we had to deal with mostly from the impact of the Russian aggression, besides the economic impact that we're all dealing with, is at the rule of law, but the security sector. Immediately, I think it was 1 or 2 months after the Russian aggression started, we had 5 attacks near the border with Serbia on our police officers, 2 of them with firearms, one of these 2 coming from the Serbia territory. And also, as we all know, we had instances of during summer when roads were blocked, and those weren't blocked. And now this is a really important thing, that weren't blocked by our Serb citizens. Those were some kind of criminal professional groups with masks and black uniforms, because fortunately, now Serb citizens of Kosovo are fed up with such being tools in a way for such actions, and they do not react anymore. But as a last resort, now it seems that Belgrade is using more professional units to deal with these issues. So mostly it's in the security sector. As we know now, even recently with the license plates issue, yesterday, Serbia has put its army on high alert and started spreading fake news that Kosovo is having drones around the border, so they flew 2 fighter jets. We have to know that Serbia has 48 forward operational bases of its army in the line border with Kosovo, so they are not defensive, they are forward operational bases. So this was the tension that we were dealt with. And of course, every country has limited capacity, so this meant that we had to focus on these issues and not deal with others.
Thank you. Mr. Mr. Janine, what effects do you see of these geopolitical tensions? Do you feel that rule of law reforms are maybe fading a bit? I mean, the picture you painted was already a bit bleak, but do you feel that rule of law reforms, that there's even less sort of attention to them in light of these geopolitical tensions that we now see?
Speaking for Bosnian context, I mean, it's obvious that the crisis in Bosnia is lasting institutional and political for many years. And also there is another layer of complexity with regard to Bosnia, a specific role of international community embodied in the institution of High Representative, which recently triggered a lot of dissatisfaction among the Bosnia and Herzegovina citizens. Just a few sentences on what happened for the people who are not following. On the very day when Bosnia and Herzegovina had elections just a month ago, High Representative basically imposed amendments on the constitution of the Bosnia and the Federation of the Bosnia and Herzegovina, which triggered, as I mentioned, dissatisfaction of the Bosnian and Herzegovina citizens, because they recognize that as not compatible with democratic standards. So why is that important? In the Peace Implementation Council, which is governing the work of High Representative, there are several countries which interests are not necessarily the same as the interest of the Bosnia and Herzegovina in terms of joining the EU, and situation is still basically frozen since the end of conflict. So Bosnia and Herzegovina, what I would like to say, that Bosnia and Herzegovina is probably even more vulnerable to geopolitical turmoils after the Russian aggression on the Ukraine. And in particular, having in mind that one part of the country in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Republic of Srpska, is openly basically supporting the Russian aggression. So that's basically another layer of the problems when it comes to the political situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So of course, in such context, that democratization and rule of law are not priorities.
Mm. Well, Ms. Cramon, if the countries in the region are so vulnerable, right, to these geopolitical developments, should the EU then maybe set the democratization, rule of law demands aside for a little bit and maybe focus on security fully, or how do you see that?
I think this is not an either-or question. I mean, we would not do a favor to the citizens, as Srđan has rightly said. We owe it to the citizens that the transformative power goes hand in hand with security. I think we have to take care of the stability and peace and reconciliation and dialogue and everything. But there will be no, let's say, credit on domestic reforms, because this would not make sense. If we go along in this Berlin process, and if we hopefully tomorrow or the head of states manage to sign these agreements, this is a huge step forward. We have to communicate on that. We have to say why it is important. But on the other hand, in all the stabilization association agreements, in all SAA, we have clearly said, and head of states and all the governments have signed what they are up to. So I think there should be no discount on anything, because what Srđan has said, otherwise the people would leave, would go to places where they find rule of law, where they find a proper political and economical environment, where they have independence, judiciary, and so on and so forth. So it is up to us to create these standards which people would like to see in the European Union, but also back at home. And it is up to us to implement that and to sanction if things are not working. What I would maybe differentiate a little bit from, I do not see a direct parallel from the Ukraine war in the region. I see that some of the, let's say, actors, political actors, try to get to benefit from that. I think that's not okay. I think we should really watch the situation and witness or observe the situation very carefully, but we should not overdo this and compare things which are not too much related to each other. I'm not saying that it is calm and smooth and absolutely, how to say, irrelevant, but sometimes you see also make-up stories, and this can also endanger then spontaneous reactions which are not intended or wanted. So I call on each and everyone, not on one side, to really make sure that everything which is in their responsibility is really being done and not to provoke the other side.
Thank you. Mr. Majstorović, do you also feel that we should detach these issues a little bit and maybe from each other, and maybe do you feel that a merit-based accession process is still possible in these times, this year?
I'm risking to be a very boring interlocutor, just to agree with Viola, what she said. And I honestly believe that we need to be very cautious making an equation sign between what's going on in Ukraine and what's going on in the region. These are, I would say, very, very separate things. Listen, the geopolitical importance of the Western Balkans existed even before the start of the war. The war in Ukraine just amplified it, and that's the fact. We had strategic infrastructure investments coming from the third parties in the region. We had energy sector investments, media presence of different media outlets, cyber activities, malign political influence on bilateral relations in the region, on structural issues of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So it was there. The Ukrainian war just amplified it and obviously created a very nice niche for those who are saying, oh, now we need to focus on the geopolitical challenges. As Viola said, it's not this or that, it's everything. And let me remind us all here, issues like rule of law, reform of judiciary, fight against corruption, organized crime, media freedoms, resolution of Kosovo-Serbia normalization process. These are all elements which were very well known 10 years ago and which were put in the negotiating framework of Serbia's EU accession process. And this is why it is very, very frustrating when foreign dignitaries are pick and choose different aspects of this agenda and making it priority in relationship with my case, with my country, with Serbia. There is no this or that. It's everybody on the table, and all these things needs to be fulfilled. Should we really be honest to ourselves and say, okay, we understand what is the requirements, what are the requirements, and we are ready to deliver on it. But for that, we need to have a credible EU accession process, and that's something that, unfortunately, in this given geopolitical context, I'm still puzzled how we are not moving fast enough.
Yeah.
There are some positive moves, avoiding the candidacy status to Eastern European countries, recommendation on Bosnia and Herzegovina, recommendation repeated, unfortunately, for who knows how many times on visa liberalization for Kosovo, which are not being followed through. And this all jeopardizes the framework within which we need to resolve these issues that we are mentioning.
Thank you. I think we have about 5 minutes left, so I would like to move to the concluding statements from our speakers, and maybe a final topic to discuss is also specifically the role of civil society organizations and think tanks in the region. So maybe as a general question for all of our panelists, first, do you see room still to move forward when it comes to rule of law reforms, when it comes to anti-corruption efforts, given the, not very optimistic picture that we've discussed in this panel? And second, what role do you see specifically for the civil society organizations and the think tanks in the region, and where can they maybe step up their efforts on these topics? Mr. Ahmeti, I'd like to start with you, and please, only 1 minute, because otherwise we're running out.
I'll try to be brief. Thank you. We try to do our best as a government, of course, to have full inclusion within these processes. We have already set up mechanisms which were previously by other governments set up of public consultations, be that on concept strategies or laws. but not only in this formal sense. In most of the processes, in our endeavor for visa-free regime or the coming application for EU membership or Council of Europe application, civil society members, be them from think tanks or academia, are already involved in those processes. So it is our responsibility to lead these processes, but also to be inclusive. And hopefully we're doing a good job. We'll do a better job on whatever we are lacking currently.
Thank you. Ms. van Cramon, please.
Well, I mean, I can agree also with that. I would say that in a formal process, we see a lot of box-ticking exercises, that inclusion, maybe not referring to Kosovo, but in some of the other countries, inclusion is taking place in terms of NGOs, academia, and so on. But when I see then that there's a lot of pressure on independent media and on some of the human rights defenders, on independent activists, and so on. So the reality is definitely not as it is said in some of these EU reports, and that's why it is important, I would say, for people like our President of the EU Commission, not just to visit the head of state and the government, but also maybe Srđan and others, where you see the full picture of what's happening in these countries, and you could also name in each and every country that you have a really strong civil society, academia, independent press, investigative journalists, and so on. And I think this needs to be included in delegations of head of states, but also of other members from the EU who are visiting the region.
Thank you. Mr. Blagovčanin.
Very briefly, rule of law and anti-corruption reforms are not technical processes only, but political processes as well. So in that regard, it's about articulation of political will for those processes. So I believe that in that regard, that's the role of think tanks and civil society, articulation of demand for reforms and for change. And second thing is that, as I said in my opening statement, obviously, current approach doesn't work, doesn't deliver. So, and I quoted Einstein in that regard. So what we need here, we would need, based on lesson learned, second generation of how we call it in TI, second generation of rule of law reforms.
Thank you. Mr. Majstorović.
I mean, we have no alternatives but to be very persistent and to be boring, advocating for the real, real changes, offering ideas, requesting our presence to be included, to be involved, to monitor and communicate in an objective way to the public factual state of the affairs of the situation in our countries. And this is why in this document that you can all find in the desk in front, we ask EU, its member states, to focus on fundamentals. Eventually, it is investment in security. You cannot have a secure Europe without democratic apparatus working properly in our region, without institutions who have a clearly division of power, of competencies, who are doing their job with the professional administration. We are also asking our governments to show unity in time of crisis and different attempts to undermine Europe's cohesion. And that implies to resolve basically the pending issues which are often abused in the region, as I earlier said, as a smokescreen, while democracy and rule of law are being under threat. We have no luxury to be complacent, because if we lose, the EU lose. That's one of the conclusions. And to quote the President of the European Commission, her speech in the European Parliament when she presented the State of the Union address, when she rightfully said that the path towards stronger democracies and the path towards the Union are one and the same. We're just asking to make this very clear when meeting our representatives and stick to that rule throughout the EU integration process.
Well, thank you very much. This was, of course, only a spotlight session, meaning I think we scratched the surface of all the topics that we could talk about for way longer. nevertheless, I take away from this discussion that I think there's a need for civil society organizations, for think tanks, both in the region, in the EU, to remain persistent, as you said, to report openly about factual developments on the ground, and that should be our hope, I think, for the future years. For the rest, I'm not going to try to make some conclusions myself, so just like to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists in this session.